The blood wouldn't stop. It pulsed between Captain Marcus Webb's fingers in rhythmic spurts, each one weaker than the last, each one counting down to zero. Across the makeshift operating table, the Japanese woman's lips had gone from pink to blue to gray in the span of 30 seconds. "She's coding," Nurse Patterson said, her voice tight with something between urgency and satisfaction. "Blood pressure 60/40 and dropping." The kerosene lamps flickered, casting dancing shadows across the converted warehouse that served as their surgical theater. Rain hammered the corrugated tin roof with such violence that Webb could barely hear his own thoughts. He looked at the clock mounted on the crumbling concrete wall. 11:47 p.m. "She won't survive the night," someone muttered from the doorway. Webb didn't turn to see who. His eyes were fixed on the woman's face, watching the color drain from her skin like water from a broken vessel. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away. This woman was the enemy. Her uniform, now cut away and discarded in a bloody heap on the floor, bore the insignia of the Imperial Japanese Army. Men wearing that same insignia had killed his younger brother at Guadalcanal, had starved and tortured the American POWs, currently recovering in his own hospital ward, had committed atrocities that turned his stomach when he read the intelligence reports, but his hands remained pressed against her abdomen, feeling the pulse of failing life beneath his palms. He thought of the Hippocratic oath framed on the wall of his Boston office, gathering dust 3,000 miles away. First, do no harm. The words mocked him now. What harm was there in letting nature take its course? What harm in conserving his limited supplies for American boys who deserved them? What harm in walking away from an enemy who would have shown no mercy to him? Webb's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "Then we have until morning," he said quietly. The words felt like they came from someone else. "Prep OR2. Get me 4 units of O negative, all the gauze we have left, and someone find me an anesthesiologist who hasn't been drinking." He paused, then added with steel in his voice, "I'm not letting her die on my watch." The silence that followed was broken only by the rain and the distant rumble of artillery. Patterson stared at him like he'd lost his mind. The corpsman in the doorway took a step back, and somewhere in the darkness outside a soldier laughed bitterly. 18 hours earlier, the jeep had come screaming into the camp, spraying mud across the triage tent like shrapnel. Captain Webb had been elbows deep in the chest cavity of a 19-year-old private from Kansas, trying to repair a sucking chest wound that whistled with every breath. He barely glanced up when the vehicle skidded to a halt. Emergency arrivals were routine. Death was routine. The Philippines in 1945 was a machine that processed young men into corpses with industrial efficiency. "Captain Webb!" The voice belonged to Sergeant Morrison, a military policeman who usually handled deserters and black market operations, not medical emergencies. "We got a situation." Webb tied off the last suture, checked the private's breathing, steady now, good, and stepped back to let the nurses take over. He stripped off his bloody gloves and turned toward the commotion outside. What he saw made him stop mid-stride. 2 American soldiers were dragging something between them. Not something. Someone. A woman. She hung limp between their grips, boots carving twin furrows in the mud. Her body was skeletal, maybe 75 pounds soaking wet, and she was definitely soaking. Blood mixed with rainwater ran off her in streams. Her face was the color of old newspaper. "Found her in a collapsed bunker about 2 miles west," Morrison said, slightly out of breath. "Japanese field hospital got hit 3 days ago. She was buried in the rubble." Webb moved closer, his medical training overriding everything else. Airway, breathing, circulation. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. Her pulse, when he found it at her neck, was thready and weak. Her skin felt like ice despite the tropical heat. Shock, severe dehydration, probable internal bleeding. He lifted one of her eyelids. The pupil was sluggish to react. "Get her inside," Webb started to say, then stopped. He'd seen the uniform. What was left of it, anyway? The distinctive cut, the Red Cross armband, the rank insignia, Imperial Japanese Army Nurse Corps. The transformation around him was immediate. The soldiers holding her loosened their grip slightly, as if suddenly realizing they were touching contaminated material. Morrison's expression hardened. From the triage tent, Webb heard someone spit into the mud. "Sir," Morrison said carefully, "we weren't sure what to do with her. Technically, she's a POW, but—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The unspoken hung in the air like smoke. Let nature take its course. Use resources on our boys. She's the enemy. Let her die. Webb stood in the rain, staring at the dying woman, his mind filled with images he couldn't suppress. His brother's last letter arrived 2 weeks after the telegram informing his parents that their youngest son was dead. The Bataan Death March survivors he'd treated last month, men so broken they flinched at shadows. The stories he'd heard whispered in the dark by patients who'd been POWs, stories of torture and starvation and casual cruelty. Every rational calculation said to walk away. The camp was low on supplies. They had 50 American wounded who needed care. Blood plasma was running short, morphine was being rationed. Spending resources on an enemy combatant was indefensible from a military standpoint and questionable from a moral one. But then he saw it, sewn into her tattered uniform with careful, precise stitches, partially obscured by blood and mud. A patch, not just a nurse's designation, something else. His Japanese was limited to what he'd picked up from interrogations and intelligence briefings, but he could read enough. Medical officer, surgeon. Webb's hands began to shake. Not from fear or cold, but from rage warring with something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like kinship. This woman was a surgeon. Like him, she'd taken an oath. Like him, she'd dedicated her life to saving others. Like him. And now she was dying in the mud while he stood there calculating whether her life was worth the cost of trying. "Sir?" Morrison prompted. The rain intensified, turning the world into a gray blur. Webb could hear his brother's voice in his memory, 14 years old, asking why Marcus wanted to be a doctor. Because everyone deserves a chance to live, young Marcus had said with all the certainty of youth. Did he still believe that? Did he believe it enough to act on it when it cost him something? When it cost him everything? "Get her inside," Webb said. His voice was steady now. "Isolation tent. I want vitals every 15 minutes. Start 2 large-bore IVs. Normal saline wide open. And someone find Corpman Liu. I need a translator." Morrison didn't move. "Sir, the men aren't going to like this." "The men don't have to like it," Webb said, meeting his eyes. "They just have to follow orders, and my orders are to get her inside before she dies out here in the mud. Is that clear, Sergeant?" "Crystal clear, sir." Morrison's tone suggested it was anything but. They carried her into the isolation tent, a canvas structure set apart from the main hospital that usually housed patients with infectious diseases. Webb followed, ignoring the stares, the whispers, the palpable hostility that rippled through the camp like a shockwave. Inside, the light was better. Gas lamps hissed, casting harsh white illumination across the examination table. As the soldiers laid her down, Webb got his first clear look at the extent of her injuries. It was worse than he'd thought. Much worse. The primary wound was obvious. Shrapnel had torn through her lower left abdomen, creating a ragged hole the size of his fist. The edges were black with necrosis. The smell of infection was overwhelming even before he peeled back the makeshift bandage she'd applied to herself. Pus and blood oozed from the wound, but that wasn't the worst of it. Her entire abdomen was distended, hard as a drum. Internal bleeding, almost certainly. Possibly a perforated bowel. Definitely peritonitis. The infection had spread throughout her abdominal cavity, and her body was losing the fight. He palpated carefully, methodically, the way his professors at Harvard had taught him. There was something else, a mass, a hardness, that shouldn't be there. "I need an X-ray," he said. Nurse Patterson appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of controlled fury. Rachel Patterson was a damn good nurse, maybe the best Webb had ever worked with. She was from Brooklyn, spoke 3 languages, and could place an IV line in a moving ambulance in the dark. She was also had been engaged, to a Marine named John, who died at Iwo Jima. The ring still hung around her neck on a chain. She looked at the Japanese woman on the table with undisguised hatred. "Captain, I need to speak with you. Outside." Webb kept his hands on the patient's abdomen. "Whatever you need to say it here." Patterson's jaw worked. "Sir, with all due respect, this is insane. We have 47 American boys in the main ward. 3 of them might not make it through the night. We're rationing morphine. We're down to our last 6 units of plasma, and you want to waste resources on a Jap?" The word landed like a slap. Webb had heard it 1,000 times, used it himself in unguarded moments. But hearing it now, with his hands on a dying woman's body, it sounded different, uglier. "She's a surgeon," Webb said quietly. Patterson blinked. "What?" "Look at her uniform, the patches. She's a medical officer, a surgeon, and right now, she's my patient. She's the enemy. Right now, she's dying, and I'm a doctor. That's all that matters." Patterson stared at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked out without another word. Webb closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and returned to his examination. Corpsman James Liu arrived 10 minutes later with the portable X-ray machine, such as it was. Liu was Chinese-American, from San Francisco, fluent in Japanese and Mandarin. His family had fled Shanghai in 1937 when the Japanese invaded. His aunt had died in Nanking. He took one look at the patient and his face went blank. "You want me to X-ray a Japanese soldier, sir?" "I want you to X-ray a patient," Webb said. "Can you do that, Corpman?" Liu's hands clenched into fists, then slowly relaxed. "Yes, sir." The X-ray took 20 minutes to develop in their makeshift darkroom. While they waited, Webb started the IVs himself, finding collapsed veins with practiced precision. The woman's blood pressure was barely registering. Her heart rate was over 140, her body desperately trying to compensate for massive fluid loss. He hung 2 bags of saline and opened them wide, watching the fluid run into her veins, buying her minutes. Maybe hours if they were lucky. When Liu returned with the X-ray film, Webb held it up to the lamp. What he saw made his breath catch. The shrapnel was clearly visible, a jagged piece of metal lodged in her lower abdomen. But it wasn't just sitting there. It was pressed against the descending aorta, one of the body's major blood vessels. One wrong move would sever it, and she'd bleed out in seconds. There was no margin for error. None. But that wasn't what made his hands go cold. There were old surgical scars visible on the film, evidence of previous operations. This woman had been a surgeon long enough to have scars from her own procedures, and sewn into the hem of her uniform, now visible under the harsh lamplight, were documents, credentials. Liu translated haltingly, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Dr. Keiko Yoshida, Tokyo Imperial University Medical School, graduated 1938, specialized in trauma surgery, rank, Captain, Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps. Webb stared at the documents, 1838. She was one of the first generation of female surgeons in Japan, one of maybe a dozen women to achieve that rank in a male-dominated military. She'd fought her way through prejudice and barriers to become what she was. Just like he'd fought to get into Harvard during the Depression, just like he'd worked double shifts to pay his tuition, they had more in common than he wanted to admit. "There's more, sir," Liu said, his voice strange. He held up another piece of paper, this one stained with old blood. "It's a list, names, dates, looks like medical records." Webb took it carefully. Even without translation, he could see what it was. A log of patients, Allied prisoners, Americans, British, Australians, treatment dates, conditions, outcomes. His stomach turned. "She operated on our POWs," Liu said flatly. The words hung in the air like an accusation, or an absolution. Webb didn't know which. Had she saved them, or had she been part of the machine that tortured them? There was no way to know. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The decision was made at 7:15 p.m. Webb assembled his team in the operating room, such as it was. The converted warehouse still smelled of motor oil and rust beneath the harsh odor of disinfectant. Rain pounded the tin roof with such violence that he had to raise his voice to be heard. Dr. Harold Green was already at the anesthesia station, checking the ether supply with the methodical precision of a man who'd seen it all. At 52, Green was the oldest member of the surgical team, a veteran of the First World War who'd re-enlisted after Pearl Harbor. His hands were steady despite the tremor of age. His eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, were sharp and evaluating. "We have 6 hours of ether, Marcus," Green said without preamble. "Maybe 7 if I'm conservative. After that, she starts waking up mid-surgery, and that's assuming her body can handle the anesthesia at all in her condition." "It'll have to be enough," Webb said. Nurse Patterson was scrubbing in at the steel basin, her movements sharp and angry. She didn't look at him, didn't speak. Just scrubbed with mechanical precision, each stroke of the brush an act of suppressed rage. Corpsman Liu organized supplies with equal silence. His jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped. Only Private Tommy Reeves, the surgical assistant, seemed uncertain rather than hostile. At 19, Reeves was the youngest member of the team, fresh from Texas with a drawl that reminded Webb of home. He'd been in the Philippines for 6 weeks, still believed in clear lines between right and wrong, good and evil. The war hadn't complicated his worldview yet. It would. Tonight, probably. "Listen up," Webb said, pulling their attention. "This surgery is going to take 8 to 9 hours minimum. The shrapnel is lodged against the descending aorta. One slip and she bleeds out in seconds. Beyond that, she has massive internal infection, possible perforated bowel, and we won't know what else until we open her up. The odds are bad. Very bad. But we're going to try anyway. If anyone can't commit to that, I need to know now." Patterson's hands stilled in the basin. For a moment, Webb thought she might walk out. Then she spoke, her voice low and controlled. "I can do my job, Captain. Don't confuse professionalism with approval." "That's all I'm asking for," Webb said. He turned to Liu. "Corpsman." Liu stared at the operating table where the patient lay, already intubated and draped. "My aunt died in Nanking, sir. Raped and murdered by Japanese soldiers. My grandmother starved to death in Shanghai. I have every reason to let this woman die." He paused, his hands gripping the edge of the supply cart. "But you're right. She's a surgeon, and maybe that means something. Maybe. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was enough." "Reeves?" Webb asked. The young private straightened. "My daddy always said, 'Do right even when it costs you, sir.' Seems like this is one of those times." Webb nodded slowly. "All right then, let's save a life." The first incision was made at 7:15 p.m. exactly. Webb's scalpel parted skin that felt like paper, thin and fragile from malnutrition. Blood welled up immediately, more than it should have. Her clotting factors were compromised. Everything about this woman was compromised. "Clamp," he said. Patterson slapped the instrument into his palm without hesitation. Whatever her feelings about the patient, her professionalism was absolute. They worked in rhythm, clamping bleeders, cutting through layers of tissue, skin, subcutaneous fat, fascia, muscle. Each layer revealed more damage. Webb had seen plenty of infected wounds, but this was something else. The tissue was gray and necrotic in places, black with gangrene in others. The smell intensified as they went deeper. Jesus, Reeves whispered. How is she alive? Stubbornness, Webb muttered. Or maybe she's not ready to die. 30 minutes in, they hit the first major complication. The previous wounds, the old surgical scars visible on the X-ray, had created massive adhesions. Scar tissue had fused her organs together into a solid mass. The colon was stuck to the abdominal wall. The small intestine had adhered to itself in loops. Everything was concrete hard and impossible to separate without causing more bleeding. This is going to take hours, Green said from his position at the head of the table. Her pressure's already dropping, 85/50. Then we work fast and careful, Webb said, knowing the contradiction even as he spoke it. But there was no other option. He began the painstaking work of separating organs, cutting through adhesions one fiber at a time. Each cut risked tearing tissue. Each pull threatened catastrophic bleeding. Patterson suctioned constantly, the tube slurping blood and pus from the surgical field. The waste basin filled, was emptied, filled again. An hour passed, then 2. Webb's back began to ache from standing hunched over the table. His hands cramped from the delicate work. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the cool night air. Patterson wiped his forehead without being asked, anticipating his needs with the precision born of hundreds of surgeries together. At the 2-hour mark, they finally reached the peritoneal cavity. What Webb saw made his stomach turn. The entire space was filled with pus. A massive abscess had formed, pockets of infection throughout the abdominal cavity. The smell was overwhelming. Reeves gagged, turned, and ran from the operating room. They heard him vomiting outside. "Leave him," Webb said when Liu moved to follow. "He'll come back." 30 seconds later, Reeves did, pale as a ghost but determined. "Sorry, sir," he mumbled. "It's all right, son. First time I saw an abscess like this, I did the same thing. Now grab that retractor and help me drain this." They spent the next hour debriding the infection, cutting away dead tissue, irrigating with saline until the fluid ran clear. It was like excavating a wound, removing layer after layer of necrotic material. Patterson worked mechanically, her face a mask, but Webb noticed her hands were gentle on the tissue, professional despite everything. "How is she still breathing?" she murmured at one point, almost to herself. "I don't know," Webb admitted, "but she is, and we keep working." Liu, who'd been managing supplies at the periphery, was called in to help with retraction. He hesitated for just a moment before stepping to the table. Webb saw him stare down into the open abdomen, saw something shift in his expression. It was one thing to hate an enemy in abstract, another to see inside their body and realize they were just flesh and blood. Just human, no different from any other patient. "Retractor," Webb said quietly, offering him a way in. Liu took it. "I've got it, doctor." 3 hours into the surgery, they finally had the surgical field clear enough to address the shrapnel. Webb could see it now, a jagged piece of metal the size of his thumb lodged against the descending aorta. The X-ray hadn't lied. One wrong move, and she was dead. But there was more. As he carefully explored the area with his fingers, feeling what he couldn't see, he found something else. Another fragment. Smaller, hidden beneath the first, pressed against the portal vein. "We've got 2 pieces," he said. "The second one's against the portal vein." Green swore softly. "Can't take them both at once?" "No. We take the portal vein fragment first. That bleed we can control with pressure and suture. The aortic bleed we cannot. If I pull the wrong one first, she's gone before we can clamp." Patterson met his eyes across the table. "Then we do portal vein first. I'm ready." The plan was sound. The execution would be anything but. Webb positioned his forceps around the smaller fragment, the one pressing against the portal vein. Everyone in the room held their breath. Even the rain seemed to quiet. He pulled, gently, steadily. The fragment resisted, caught on something. More pressure. Still stuck. Webb's hands were steady, but his heart hammered. Too much force, and he'd tear the vein. Too little, and the shrapnel wouldn't come free. Just right. Had to be just right. The fragment suddenly came loose with a wet sound. Webb dropped it into the pan. No bleeding. Perfect extraction. The clatter of metal on metal was the loudest sound in the world. "One down," Green said. "Pressure's holding at 78/48. Now the main fragment, the killer." Webb studied it from every angle, probing gently with instruments, mapping what he couldn't see. The shrapnel had a barb on it, like a fishhook, embedded in the wall of the aorta. He couldn't pull it straight out without tearing the vessel, had to unhook it first. "I need a curved probe," he said. Reeves scrambled through the instrument tray. "Sir, we don't have one fine enough." Webb stared at the shrapnel, thinking. They needed something strong enough to manipulate metal but delicate enough not to tear tissue. Something curved to the exact angle needed to slip between shrapnel and aorta. "Hand me that straight probe," he said suddenly. Liu passed it over. Webb examined it, then looked at the kerosene lamp burning nearby. "What are you doing?" Patterson asked. "Improvising." Webb held the probe's tip in the lamp flame until it glowed red, then used forceps to bend it to precisely the angle he needed. He dunked it in saline to cool it, then held it up to the light. Perfect curve. Field medicine at its finest. He slid the improvised instrument between the shrapnel and the aorta. Working entirely by feel, he traced the barb's position, found where it hooked into tissue. Gently, carefully, he worked the probe beneath it. Minutes passed. 5. 10. 15. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Webb's entire world narrowed to the sensation in his fingertips. The subtle difference between metal and flesh. The resistance of the barb. The pulse of the aorta against his instrument. Finally, he felt it give. The barb released from the vessel wall. The shrapnel was now mobile but still touching the aorta. One wrong pull and it could still tear. "Ready for extraction," he said. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, distant. Patterson positioned herself with gauze and clamps, ready for bleeding. Liu had blood ready to transfuse. Green watched the monitors like a hawk. Reeves held the retractor with white-knuckled grip. Webb gripped the shrapnel with his forceps, took a breath, and pulled in one smooth, steady motion. The fragment came free. He dropped it into the pan with a clang. Everyone stared at the surgical field, waiting for the arterial spray that would mean death. Seconds passed. 5, 10, 15. No blood. No tear. Clean extraction. "I'll be damned," Green whispered. The room erupted in released tension. Reeves laughed, high and nervous. Liu slumped against the wall. Even Patterson's eyes were wet behind her mask. But Webb didn't celebrate. "We still have to close," he said. "And she's barely hanging on. Patterson, how much blood have we given her?" 4 units. That was our last O negative. Then we work fast. Let's bring her home." The first rays of dawn were filtering through the gaps in the warehouse walls when Webb tied the final suture. His hands shook with exhaustion as he stepped back from the table, swaying slightly. 9 hours and 23 minutes. He'd been on his feet for over 9 hours, hunched over a dying woman who had every reason to be dead, but somehow, impossibly, wasn't. "Vitals?" His voice was hoarse from calling instructions through the night. Green looked up from his monitors, and for the first time in hours, something like hope crossed his weathered face. "Blood pressure 92/58, heart rate 108. She's stabilizing, Marcus. Against every law of medicine and common sense, she's actually stabilizing." Patterson stripped off her gloves with movements that suggested she'd used the last reserves of her strength. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red from fatigue and the sting of antiseptic fumes. But her hands had been steady through every moment of those 9 hours. Whatever her hatred for the enemy, her dedication to the work had been absolute. "I need to sit down," Reeves said suddenly, his Texas drawl thick. "Sir, I need to sit down right now or I'm going to fall down." "Sit," Webb said. The young private collapsed onto a stool, his head in his hands. He'd grown up tonight, watched a miracle and a nightmare unfold simultaneously over 9 hours, seen what the human body could endure, seen what human hands could repair. Liu was already wheeling the patient toward recovery, his movements automatic despite exhaustion. Webb noticed something different in the way he positioned the gurney, careful not to jostle her, gentle, like she was a person, not an enemy. Webb stumbled to the basin and washed the blood from his hands. The water ran red, then pink, then finally clear. His reflection in the small mirror showed a stranger, hollow-eyed and gray-faced. He looked 10 years older than when the surgery began. "You should rest," Green said, appearing beside him. "I'll monitor her." "No." Webb dried his hands on a towel that had once been white. "I stay with her. If she dies now, after all this—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Green nodded slowly. "Then I'll bring coffee. The real stuff. Not that motor oil the mess hall serves." They moved the patient to the isolation tent, the same canvas structure where Webb had first examined her 18 hours ago. It felt like a lifetime. He pulled a chair beside her bed and sat heavily, every muscle screaming. The woman's face was still pale, but there was color in her lips now. Her breathing was stronger, steadier. The monitors Green had set up beeped with reassuring rhythm. She was alive. It didn't seem possible, but she was alive. Webb must have dozed because suddenly it was full morning and someone was shaking his shoulder. He jerked awake, his hand instinctively reaching for the patient's wrist to check her pulse. Still there. Still steady. "Captain Webb." It was Patterson, holding a tray with coffee and something that might generously be called breakfast. "She's waking up." Webb's exhaustion vanished. He stood, leaning over the bed. The woman's eyelids were fluttering, small movements of her fingers against the blanket. Then her eyes opened. For a moment, there was only confusion in those dark eyes. Then awareness flooded in, and with it, terror. She tried to sit up, gasped in pain, fell back. Her eyes darted around the tent, taking in the American uniforms, the medical equipment, her own bandaged state. She understood where she was, what had happened. Her mouth opened, but only a dry croak emerged. Webb reached for a cup of water with ice chips. "Don't try to talk yet," he said gently. Then, realizing she probably didn't understand English, he gestured for Liu. The corpsman appeared moments later, still looking exhausted but alert. When he saw the patient was conscious, something complicated crossed his face. This was the moment of truth. The enemy was no longer an unconscious body on a table. She was awake, aware, human. "Tell her she's safe," Webb said. "Tell her she was badly injured and we operated. Tell her she's going to survive." Liu spoke in rapid Japanese. The woman's eyes widened. She stared at Webb with an expression he couldn't read. Disbelief? Gratitude? Fear? All of the above? When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Liu translated haltingly. She asks, "Why? Why didn't you let her die?" Webb pulled the chair closer, sat so he was at her eye level, rather than looming over her. "Tell her I'm a surgeon. Like her. Tell her that's all that mattered," Liu translated. The woman's eyes filled with tears. They ran down her temples into her hair. Her lips moved, forming words too quiet for Liu to hear. He leaned closer, listened, then straightened with a strange expression. "Sir, she says she was at Camp O'Donnell, in the Philippines. She treated Allied POWs there." The temperature in the tent seemed to drop. Camp O'Donnell, site of some of the worst atrocities against American prisoners, where captured soldiers had died by the hundreds from starvation, disease, and brutality, where the guards had been monsters. Liu's face had gone rigid. "She says she tried to help them, that she operated on wounded prisoners in secret, that she was punished for it, beaten, transferred to a field unit." Patterson, standing in the doorway, made a sound like she'd been struck. "Is she claiming she was a hero? That she saved our boys?" "I don't know what she's claiming," Webb said carefully, "but we can verify it. Liu, ask her if she kept records." The woman nodded weakly. Her hand moved to gesture at something, then fell back. She spoke again, the words coming in fragments between gasps of pain. "She says her medical kit, hidden in the bunker where they found her, metal box, buried under rubble on the left side. She kept records of every Allied prisoner she treated, names, conditions where they were transferred." Webb looked at Liu. "Can we retrieve it?" "I'll send men now, sir." Liu's voice was carefully neutral, but his hands were shaking. Within an hour, the box was found exactly where she'd described, waterproof, battered, but intact. Inside was a journal wrapped in oilcloth, 237 names, American, British, Australian, Filipino, each entry meticulously documented, patient name, service number, injury or illness, treatment provided, date, and most importantly, transfer location. Webb read through it with growing astonishment. The detail was extraordinary. This woman had risked her life to keep these records. Some entries had notes beside them. Survived, sent to Cabanatuan. Deceased, dysentery, no medicine available. Operated successfully, amputated leg to save life. There were names he recognized from intelligence reports. Men who'd been listed as missing, whose fates were unknown. Here was documentation of what happened to them, where they'd been sent. Some might still be alive. Patterson appeared beside him, reading over his shoulder. He saw her finger stop on one entry, saw her face go white. "John," she whispered. "Oh my God. John Patterson, Norfolk, Virginia. Gunshot wound, left shoulder, July 1943. Treated successfully, transferred to Cabanatuan camp. Condition, stable. Her fiancé, the man she'd thought dead, listed here, treated by the woman on that bed, possibly still alive." Patterson's legs gave out. Webb caught her, helped her to a chair. She was shaking, the journal clutched in her hands. "He could be alive," she said. "Marcus, he could be alive because of her." Liu took the journal next, his hands reverent now. He flipped through pages, searching, then stopped. His finger traced a line. "Chen Mei-ling, Shanghai, China, dysentery, treated with available medicines, died March 1942. His voice broke. "My aunt. She was there. Dr. Yoshida tried to save her." He looked up at Webb, tears streaming down his face. "She documented my aunt's death, recorded her name so she wouldn't be forgotten. A Japanese doctor cared enough about a Chinese woman to write down her name. The revelation spread through the camp like wildfire. Within hours, Major Douglas Keating, the intelligence officer, was in the tent with a team of translators and analysts. The journal was photographed, every page copied, coordinates were extracted. Within 2 days, search operations were launched, and within a week, the first POW camp was found based on Dr. Yoshida's documentation. 47 Allied prisoners, liberated, alive. When the news reached the camp, the atmosphere shifted. The soldiers who'd wanted to let the Japanese woman die in the mud now stood outside the isolation tent, silent and respectful. Some brought offerings, a can of peaches from their rations, a chocolate bar, a pack of cigarettes, small gestures that said, "We were wrong about you." Patterson spent hours by Yoshida's bedside, learning through Liu's translation about how the doctor had treated her fiancé, how she'd dug shrapnel from his shoulder working by candlelight, hiding from the guards, how she'd given him her own food rations to help him heal, how she'd argued with the camp commander to get him transferred to Cabanatuan instead of to the labor camps where men died within weeks. "Why?" Patterson finally asked. "Why risk so much for enemy soldiers?" Yoshida's answer, translated by Liu, was simple. "Because they were patients. Because I took an oath. Because if I let hatred guide my hands, I would no longer be a doctor. I would be a murderer." Webb watched this transformation from the doorway, the enemy becoming human, the monster becoming a woman who'd risked everything to honor her oath. He thought about the moment in the rain when he'd almost walked away, almost let her die. What would have been lost if he had? Not just her life, but the 237 names in that journal, the intelligence that would save dozens more. The proof that even in the darkest places, humanity could survive. Patterson appeared beside him. "I owe her my life," she said quietly. "If John's alive, and the Red Cross is checking Cabanatuan now, it's because she saved him. I wanted her to die on that table, Marcus. I prayed for it." "I know," Webb said. "So did I at first. What changed?" He thought about it. "I realized that the moment I let hatred guide my hands, I stopped being a healer. I become just another soldier. Just another person perpetuating the cycle." He paused. She understood that. She was surrounded by people who'd embraced cruelty, and she refused. That took more courage than anything I've ever done. 3 weeks later, word came from Cabanatuan. John Patterson was alive. Wounded, malnourished, but alive. He'd survived because a Japanese surgeon had cared enough to save an enemy's life. Patterson wept when she heard. Then she went to Yoshida's bedside. The doctor was recovering well, strong enough to sit up now, to eat solid food, and did something that made every person in the tent stop and stare. She bowed, deep and formal, the way she'd seen Japanese prisoners bow. Yoshida's eyes went wide. Then she bowed back, as much as her healing abdomen would allow. No words were needed. 2 women, 2 former enemies, connected by an act of mercy that rippled across time. The war ended 4 months later. August 1945 brought Hiroshima, then Nagasaki, then the Emperor's surrender broadcast. Webb heard it in the hospital, surrounded by patients who cheered and wept with relief. It was over. Finally, impossibly over. But in the isolation tent, Dr. Akemi Yoshida wept for different reasons. Her city, her family, her country, devastated by atomic fire. Webb found her curled on her bed, sobbing silently, and for a moment he didn't know what to do. Then he sat beside her, said nothing, and simply stayed. Sometimes presence was the only medicine that mattered. The question of what to do with her became urgent. Technically, she was a prisoner of war. She could be tried for war crimes. She had served in the Imperial Army, after all, had been present at camps where atrocities occurred, but she also had the journal, had the testimony of liberated POWs who remembered the Japanese nurse who'd risked everything to help them. Had Webb's statement about her medical expertise and humanitarian efforts. The military tribunal convened in Manila. Webb testified for 3 hours, presenting evidence of her secret operations on Allied prisoners, her meticulous record-keeping that had led to the liberation of over 150 POWs across multiple camps. Patterson testified about her fiancé's treatment. Liu spoke about his aunt's dignified documentation. Even Major Keating, initially skeptical, testified that Dr. Yoshida's intelligence had been invaluable. The verdict came back. Not guilty of war crimes, recognized as a humanitarian, granted passage back to Japan. The day before her departure, Webb found her packing the few belongings she'd accumulated, medical texts he'd lent her, a nurse's uniform Patterson had given her to replace the tattered one she'd arrived in, the journal, now returned to her, its pages worn from being studied by intelligence officers. "I don't know how to thank you," she said in halting English. She'd been studying, learning phrases, determined to communicate directly rather than always through translators. "You gave me life. You gave me purpose again." Webb shook his head. "You gave yourself purpose. You kept those records knowing you could be executed for it. You operated on enemy soldiers when your own commanders ordered you not to. You did that. I just removed some shrapnel. She smiled slightly. You did more than that, Captain Webb. You showed me that the enemy can have mercy, that hatred is not inevitable, that even in war, we can choose to be human. She paused, then reached into her bag and pulled out something small, an origami crane, folded from surgical gauze with meticulous precision. In Japan, the crane symbolizes hope, healing. 1,000 cranes can grant a wish. She pressed it into his hand. I cannot fold 1,000, but I can give you this one. To remember that your mercy saved more than just me. It saved everyone whose name is in that journal, everyone who will come home because of the intelligence you helped me preserve by keeping me alive. Webb looked at the delicate crane, impossibly intricate. I'll keep it, he said, always. And I will keep these, she said, gesturing to the surgical instruments he'd lent her for training the Filipino nurses. No, Webb said. Those are yours. Use them to save lives. Use them to rebuild. Her eyes widened. I cannot accept such a gift. Yes, you can, because you're a surgeon, and surgeons save lives. That's what these instruments are for. He paused. Besides, I have a feeling you'll put them to better use than I ever could. She bowed deeply. Then I will honor them, and I will honor you. By saving as many lives as I can. By teaching the next generation that medicine transcends nationality. That our oath is to humanity, not to flags. They corresponded for years after the war. Letters arriving every few months, crossing the Pacific with news of lives saved and students trained. Yoshida returned to devastated Tokyo and immediately began working in a makeshift clinic treating bomb victims. The injuries were catastrophic. Radiation burns, traumatic amputations, injuries from collapsed buildings. She worked 18-hour days with the instruments Webb had given her, training young doctors in the rubble of the old medical school. In 1948, she wrote to tell him she'd been offered a position at the rebuilt Tokyo Imperial University, one of the first women on the faculty. She was creating a new curriculum, one that emphasized humanitarian medicine and the treatment of all patients, regardless of nationality or status. She included a class syllabus. One entire section was devoted to the story of an American surgeon who'd saved an enemy's life. Webb's name was there. His decision, the 9-hour surgery, It was being taught to every medical student in her program. Webb wrote back to tell her about his practice in Boston, how he'd returned to find his old office dusty and waiting, how he'd started teaching at Harvard, using her story as a case study in medical ethics, how the origami crane sat on his desk, carefully preserved in a glass case, and how every student who came through his office asked about it, how he told them the truth, that mercy was harder than hate, but infinitely more powerful. Patterson wrote to Yoshida too. She'd married John in 1946, a small ceremony attended by most of the medical staff from the Philippines hospital. She sent photos of her wedding, of her first child born in 1947, of her second in 1949. None of this exists without you, she wrote. My husband, my children, my future, all of it stems from your courage in that camp, your refusal to let hatred guide your hands. I will tell my children about you, about the enemy who became a hero, about the doctor who proved that mercy transcends borders. In 1952, Liu traveled to Japan on business. He'd become an importer, building bridges between American and Asian markets. He visited Yoshida's clinic, brought flowers to a memorial she'd erected for all the patients she couldn't save, including his aunt. They spent a day together, two people connected by loss and healing. He wrote to Webb afterward, I thought I'd feel anger, seeing her again, but I felt peace. She carries the weight of every death, every person she couldn't save. She hasn't forgotten, she'll never forget. But she's transformed that grief into purpose. Her clinic treats thousands. She's trained hundreds of doctors. My aunt's death wasn't meaningless because it taught Dr. Yoshida to fight harder for every life. That's legacy. The true impact became clear in 1965, 20 years after the surgery. Webb was invited to Tokyo for a medical conference. He was 64 now, graying and slower, but still sharp, still teaching, still carrying the crane in his briefcase everywhere he went. Yoshida met him at the airport. She was 58, her hair streaked with white, her face lined with years of intense work, but her eyes were the same, determined, grateful, alive. She took him to her clinic, now a modern facility that treated 200 patients daily, to the university where she was Dean of Medicine, the first woman to hold that position, to a small memorial garden where the names of Allied POWs she'd treated were carved in stone, a reminder that even enemies deserve dignity. You gave me 40 years, she said as they sat in her office drinking tea. 40 years I should not have had. I have trained 206 doctors. Each one saves conservatively dozens of lives per year. That's thousands of lives, tens of thousands, all because you chose mercy on one rainy night in 1945. Webb shook his head. You chose it first, in that camp. When you treated enemy soldiers despite orders not to. When you kept those records despite the danger. I just continued what you'd started. Then we saved each other, she said simply. You saved my body. I gave you proof that the enemy could be redeemed. That mercy wasn't weakness. We both needed that. Patterson attended the conference too, bringing her husband, still bearing the scar from Yoshida's surgery, and their 3 children. The reunion was tearful. John Patterson bowed to the woman who'd dug shrapnel from his shoulder by candlelight, who'd argued with guards to save his life, who'd given him a future. Their children, ages 18, 16, and 13, stared in awe at the woman who'd made their existence possible. 47 people, Yoshida said quietly, looking at the family. 47 descendants from the people whose names are in my journal. Children and grandchildren who exist because I documented where prisoners were sent. Because Captain Webb kept me alive to share that information. That's not counting the ones who don't know, who don't realize their grandfather or father survived because of those records. The weight of it settled over them. 1 surgery, 9 hours, a lifetime of ripples. Webb gave his keynote speech the next day to 1,500 doctors and medical students. He told the entire story, the dying enemy in the mud, the hatred he'd had to overcome, the 9-hour surgery that should have failed, the journal that saved lives, the woman who'd become a colleague and friend. When he finished, the auditorium was silent. Then, starting slowly and building to thunder, everyone stood. The applause lasted 5 minutes. Yoshida stood in the front row, tears streaming down her face, and bowed to him. He bowed back, equals. Partners in proving that humanity could survive even war. The story was published in medical journals. Then mainstream media picked it up. Enemy surgeon saves hundreds through secret records, kept alive by American doctor who operated 9 hours. It became a symbol. 2 people choosing mercy when everything argued for hate. Choosing humanity when war demanded they see each other as things to be destroyed. Medical schools worldwide added it to their ethics curricula. The Webb-Yoshida case study, examining the moral complexity of treating enemy combatants, the responsibility of physicians to transcend nationality, the ripple effects of single decisions. In 1985, Yoshida fell ill, cancer, terminal. Webb flew to Tokyo immediately, staying by her bedside the way she'd stayed in his care 40 years earlier. The roles reversed completely. "I should have died in 1945, she told him during one of their last conversations. Her voice was weak, but her mind sharp. Everything since has been borrowed time, gift time, and I spent it well, Marcus. I spent it saving lives and teaching others to do the same, because of you. Because of us," he corrected gently. "We did this together." She smiled. "Yes, together. Enemy and enemy, choosing to see each other as human. That was the real surgery, wasn't it? Cutting away the hatred, suturing up the humanity. That's the operation that mattered." She died 3 days later, surrounded by family, students, and colleagues. Webb delivered the eulogy to a crowd of thousands, his voice breaking as he described the woman who'd proven that redemption was possible, that mercy multiplied, that one choice could echo across generations. He showed them the origami crane, now 40 years old and fragile. "She gave me this to symbolize hope," he said, "and she lived that hope every day. 206 doctors trained, thousands of lives saved, hundreds of thousands touched, all because we chose to see each other as human rather than enemy." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Medical students who'd learned from her teachings, patients she'd saved, families who existed because of her courage. "She told me once that I gave her 40 years, but she gave the world something far greater. She proved that our better nature can survive even the worst circumstances. That mercy isn't weakness, it's the strongest force we have. That the enemy is only the enemy until someone chooses to see them differently." Webb died 7 years later in 1992, at 81. The origami crane was buried with him, placed carefully in his hands. In his will, he left funds to establish the Webb-Yoshida Medical Exchange, sponsoring doctors to study between the United States and Japan, continuing the bridge they'd built. Patterson lived to 95, dying in 2020, surrounded by 47 descendants, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and 1 great-great-grandchild. A family tree that existed because a Japanese surgeon had documented a wounded prisoner's location, and because an American surgeon had kept that Japanese doctor alive. At her funeral, her oldest granddaughter read from Dr. Yoshida's journal. J. Patterson, Norfolk, Virginia. Gunshot wound, left shoulder, treated successfully, transferred to Cabanatuan. Condition, stable. Then she looked up at the assembled family. These words, written by an enemy doctor in secret, gave us all life. She risked execution to write them. Captain Webb risked his career to save her. They both chose mercy when hate would have been easier. And because of those choices, we're all here. Today, the story is taught in medical schools across the world. The journal is in the Smithsonian, preserved behind glass. Webb's surgical instruments, the ones he gave Yoshida, are displayed in Tokyo Imperial University's Medical Museum. And in both Boston and Tokyo, monuments stand. 2 hands clasped, American and Japanese. Surgeon and surgeon, enemy and friend. The inscription reads simply, "She won't survive the night, but she did, because mercy is stronger than hate. 1945, forever." Medical students still visit, still read the plaques describing the 9-hour surgery, the journal of names, the 40 years of borrowed time spent saving lives, and they learn the lesson that Webb and Yoshida proved, that our humanity is not destroyed by war, it's tested. And in how we respond to that test, in the choices we make when everything argues against compassion, we define not just ourselves, but the world we leave behind. One surgery, 9 hours, 80 years of ripples, still spreading, still teaching, still proving that mercy, once given, never dies.